During the last 2,000 years of church history, for most of that time, Israel was desolate. The Jewish people have not been living in the land as a nation, a fully thriving and populated nation, for most of the 2,000 years of church history. And that created a really big problem for the church, because there are hundreds of prophecies in the Bible that talk about Israel being a thriving, successful nation speaking Hebrew in the years that precede the return of the Lord Jesus. And so the church concluded that most of those prophecies were irrelevant and inaccurate because they didn't make any sense to the reader at the time when Israel was being trampled by a successive series of Gentile superpowers that were occupying the land, and it wasn't fertile, and it wasn't thriving, and there were hardly any Jewish people living there, and it was dominated by a series of people groups who were mostly warlike Muslims. And so the prophecies in the Bible didn't make a lot of sense. And so the church just decided that those prophecies were not for our time and they were irrelevant. And I want to give you an example of one of the prophecies that would not have made any sense to a Christian until this last generation. I'm going to read to you now from the prophet Zechariah and chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 and verses 9. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for the nations, and all who try to move it will injure themselves. On that day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. Now, when you think about that, it really doesn't make sense when you see the condition of Jerusalem just 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the Ottoman Turks were ruling Jerusalem. They had been ruling it for 400 years. They had imposed a tax on every tree in Israel, and so the Jewish people living in Israel had cut down every tree in the land because they could not afford to pay the Turks the taxes on the trees. And so the land had become desolate and full of swamps and malaria, and it wasn't fertile, and none of the nations would have ever desired to come against Jerusalem and attack it because it had nothing to offer. It had no wealth or water or minerals or fertility. And so that's an example of how desolate the land of Jerusalem was for the last basically 1900 years. And even Mark Twain, the author who visited Jerusalem only 140 years ago, he wrote this in his book, Innocents Abroad. Mark Twain said, "Rags, wretchedness, and poverty, and dirt. Jerusalem is mournful and dreary and lifeless. I would certainly not desire to live here." So that just gives us an idea of how prophecies wouldn't make sense until certain things fall into place. Now, when you look at modern Israel and modern Jerusalem, every one of these prophecies just comes to light. We read newspaper headlines every day about the controversy swirling over Jerusalem, and the nations are raging over Jerusalem and who owns this part of it and who owns that part of it, and do the Jewish people even have a right to build apartments on parts of eastern Jerusalem? And so we're going to see all of these prophecies just light up before us right now. But for us to really be able to understand Israel, we have to understand why it matters to God and why his heart is ever bound to this people and to this land. And so we're going to go back to a very ancient covenant that God made with Abraham. We're going to be looking at Genesis, where God called an Iraqi man named Abram out of his father's idolatrous household. Where Abram lived was basically the modern country of Iraq, and it was called Ur of the Chaldees. And God called him, and we're going to see that call in Genesis chapter 12.